Maria Lopez didn't have much, but she made the best of it for herself and her young son Leo. Life was a daily struggle. 2 jobs, a cramped apartment, and little time to spare, but she took pride in creating a stable environment where Leo felt loved and safe. They lived in a small but busy neighborhood, surrounded by the hum of city life. Their building was old, a little rundown, but it was home. Maria liked that Leo had friends around, a small park nearby, and a school he enjoyed. She often told herself that, despite the challenges, she was giving him the best she could. The building was managed by Mr. Gibson, a stern, fastidious man with a strong grip on the rules. Maria had seen him interact with tenants before and had noticed a pattern. He was civil but never particularly warm, and with certain tenants, especially those from different ethnic backgrounds, he seemed less forgiving, more prone to reprimands or suspicious stares. She brushed it off as one of his quirks, something she could ignore so long as she kept to herself. One afternoon, Mr. Gibson knocked on her door with a sealed letter. Maria's heart sank as she took it, the heavy envelope feeling ominous in her hand. She quickly thanked him, shut the door, and tore it open. Her hands trembled as she read through the letter, an eviction notice. It was brief and stated that she had violated her lease by disturbing the peace and causing property damage, accusations she couldn't comprehend. She always kept her apartment clean, and Leo was a well-behaved boy. Any disturbances from them were unimaginable. Confused and panicked, Maria found herself running through recent weeks, trying to piece together any event that could have prompted this. The thought of losing their home sent her mind spiraling, visions of instability and fear flashing in her mind. The idea of uprooting Leo, of pulling him out of school and taking him away from his friends, was almost unbearable. She knew he'd felt the strain on her, the exhaustion in her voice, but she'd done everything possible to shield him from life's harder edges. Now, it felt like all her efforts to build a stable life were unraveling. The more she considered the accusations, the angrier she grew. None of it made sense. She was a quiet tenant who followed the rules, and Leo was never loud. But as her thoughts circled back to Mr. Gibson's manner, the way he'd treated her with an almost polite disdain, the subtle dismissiveness she'd felt from him, the real reason for the eviction started to take shape in her mind. She thought back to whispers she'd overheard from other tenants who, like her, were from minority backgrounds. Some had shared uneasy stories about Mr. Gibson's double standards and how they were often the first to face penalties over minor issues, if not outright ignored. After hours of wrestling with her emotions, she finally resolved to confront him. She needed answers. The following morning, Maria gathered her courage and knocked on his office door. Mr. Gibson's reaction was one of faint annoyance, as if her presence was an unwelcome interruption. She explained her concerns as calmly as she could, asking him to reconsider the eviction and insisting she had done nothing wrong. Mr. Gibson barely looked up from his papers, giving her a dismissive shrug. He claimed the decision was final and hinted that he didn't need to explain himself to her. His words cut deeper than she expected, hitting at her dignity and sense of belonging. Maria left his office feeling humiliated, her face hot with anger and frustration. His response confirmed her suspicions. This wasn't about any noise or damage. She knew she'd been targeted for reasons beyond her control, and it stung. Returning to her apartment, Maria felt a wave of helplessness. She had no savings to fall back on, no friends or family nearby to take her in Leo, Indiana. The fear of losing everything they'd built was overwhelming. She knew she couldn't stay silent, not when the stakes were so high. As she gazed out the window, the city lights blurred through her tears. She realized that she'd have to fight back. Back in her apartment, Maria sat on the worn couch, her mind racing. Leo played quietly nearby, sensing her distress, though he didn't understand it. She watched him with a pang in her heart, wondering what she'd do if they had to leave this place. The thought of him sleeping on couches, moving between shelters, or being pulled out of school was unbearable. Every time she looked at him, the anger and desperation inside her only grew stronger. She spent the next few days scouring her lease, trying to find any justification for the eviction, but the words blurred together, legal terms slipping through her comprehension. She knew she was grasping at straws. Mr. Gibson had likely counted on her being intimidated and ignorant of her rights, assuming she'd leave quietly without a fuss. Each day that passed made her feel more trapped, like a cornered animal with nowhere to turn. The stress began to weigh on her. She couldn't sleep, tossing and turning, her mind rehashing her conversation with Mr. Gibson. His dismissive attitude, his cold tone, the certainty in his voice when he told her the decision was final. It all played over and over in her mind. She hated the powerlessness she felt, the helplessness that came from being unable to protect her son's home. In her despair, she found herself thinking of her brother, Alex. They hadn't spoken in years, ever since a falling out after their parents' deaths. He was stubborn, she was proud, and neither had been willing to bridge the gap. Yet now, in her moment of desperation, she realized that she didn't have anyone else who could understand, let alone help. Alex had always been driven, relentless in his pursuit of justice. He had become a lawyer after seeing the injustices their own family had faced growing up, determined to make a difference for others. Maria hesitated, feeling both anger and longing as she contemplated reaching out. Would he even take her call? She'd pushed him away after their argument, and they'd gone years without a word. But the memory of him, of his fierce loyalty, of the way he defended her in countless childhood fights, kept nagging at her. After a sleepless night, she finally gave in, dialing his number with trembling hands. The phone rang for what felt like an eternity before he picked up. His voice, gruff and unfamiliar, caught her off guard and she hesitated, unsure how to begin. She almost hung up, but then she thought of Leo, of the future that was slipping away. "Alex," she said softly, the weight of the years heavy in her voice. "It's Maria." There was a long pause, and she heard the intake of his breath, felt his surprise across the line. "Maria? It's been a long time." She nodded, though he couldn't see her. "I know. I wouldn't call if it weren't important." They spoke in cautious, halting tones, both of them skirting around the hurt and the past. But when she explained the situation, his tone shifted. His voice grew sharper, more focused, as he listened to her recount what Mr. Gibson had said, the eviction notice, and her suspicions of racial prejudice. She could feel his anger through the phone, a mirror of her own, and it gave her a strange comfort. By the end of the conversation, Alex had agreed to help. His voice was calm but determined, and he promised to look into the matter immediately. For the first time in days, Maria felt a spark of hope. She realized she wasn't alone. She had an ally, someone who cared about her and Leo, despite the years and misunderstandings that lay between them. As she hung up, she felt a surge of relief and a new sense of determination. With Alex on her side, she knew she had a chance. The day after Maria's call, Alex arrived in her neighborhood, and as soon as she saw him, Maria was struck by how much he had changed. His once carefree expression was now guarded, his eyes sharper, more intense, as though the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. Yet when he hugged her, it was with the warmth and familiarity of their childhood, as though the years and the arguments hadn't carved that distance between them. It was a fragile truce, born of necessity, but in that moment, Maria felt a flicker of hope. They settled into her cramped living room, and Alex began by asking her to recount everything that had happened with Mr. Gibson, down to the smallest details. Maria went through the whole ordeal, remembering the look in Mr. Gibson's eyes when he handed her the notice, the thinly veiled disdain in his voice. She explained how he'd refused to give her a fair explanation, brushing off her questions with indifference. Alex listened intently, scribbling notes, occasionally nodding or muttering under his breath. When she finished, Alex leaned back, his face set in a grim expression. "This isn't just about you, Maria," he said, his tone both reassuring and deeply serious. "If he's doing this to you, he's likely done it to others. People like him count on fear and silence, thinking no one will stand up to them. but he's underestimated you and me." His words stirred something in Maria. It was the first time someone had voiced what she'd been feeling, that Mr. Gibson's actions weren't just a random, unfortunate event, but part of a deeper, more systemic issue. She felt a new strength, an affirmation that this wasn't merely her fight, but something larger. For the first time, Maria began to believe that maybe they could make a difference. Over the next few days, Alex became a constant presence in her life, turning her apartment into a makeshift legal headquarters. He laid out documents, forms, and lists, filling every surface with papers and files. He made phone calls, contacted legal colleagues, and meticulously analyzed every detail of Maria's lease. Maria watched him work, marveling at his determination, and as she did, she felt the anger and helplessness she'd been carrying start to dissipate, replaced by something more powerful: resolve. But it wasn't just the legal fight that was happening. Amid their preparation, Maria and Alex found themselves tentatively rebuilding their relationship. They started sharing meals together, sitting at her small kitchen table late into the night, talking over takeout boxes and lukewarm coffee. One night, after hours of reviewing tenant laws, they drifted into a conversation about their past. The topic was delicate, like a wound that had never fully healed. "I'm sorry, Maria," Alex said, his voice soft, almost hesitant, "for not being there after Mom and Dad. I thought I was doing the right thing by focusing on my career, by fighting for others. But I should have fought for us too." Maria looked down, her fingers tracing patterns on the table. "I know, Alex, and I was so wrapped up in my own pain and anger that I didn't reach out either. I thought I could handle it alone, but I was wrong." They sat in silence for a moment, each of them lost in their own thoughts. It was a turning point, an unspoken agreement to move forward together. The tension that had simmered between them for years began to ease, and the old bond they'd shared as siblings started to resurface. Determined to strengthen their case, Alex encouraged Maria to talk to other tenants who might have experienced similar treatment from Mr. Gibson. Though Maria felt awkward and hesitant at first, she soon found herself knocking on doors, recounting her story, and asking if others had been targeted as well. Some tenants closed their doors politely, not wanting to get involved, but a few, emboldened by her bravery, began to open up. One woman, an older tenant who had lived in the building for nearly a decade, shared how Mr. Gibson had frequently issued warnings over minor infractions, like keeping a flower pot by her window or letting her grandchildren visit too often. Another tenant, a young couple who had recently moved in, revealed that Mr. Gibson had been pressuring them to leave as well, citing unreasonable noise complaints. Maria listened to their stories, her determination growing with each account. Each day, Maria returned to her apartment with new information for Alex. He listened to every story, noting patterns, assembling evidence that Mr. Gibson had not only targeted Maria, but was systematically discriminating against tenants based on race and background. With every piece of evidence they gathered, their case grew stronger, and Maria felt a newfound sense of purpose. This wasn't just about keeping her home anymore. It was about standing up to an injustice that had affected too many people for too long. Throughout the preparations, Maria began to notice changes within herself. The timid, fearful woman who'd once felt helpless against Mr. Gibson's power was transforming into someone stronger, more resolute. She was finding her voice, and with each passing day, she became more confident. She started believing in her own strength, in her right to fight for her home and her son's future. At the end of one long night, after hours of reviewing evidence and preparing statements, Maria and Alex sat back, exhausted yet triumphant. They looked at the stacks of paperwork, the testimonies, and the legal briefs they prepared, and for the first time, they saw a glimmer of victory on the horizon. Alex put his hand on hers, his expression a mixture of pride and encouragement. "You're stronger than you think, Maria. Don't ever doubt that again." As they shared a quiet moment, Maria felt a sense of peace settle over her. They were ready. Mr. Gibson had no idea what was coming. With the foundation of their case solidifying, Alex intensified his efforts, leaving no stone unturned. Every day, he worked tirelessly to gather more information and strengthen their arguments, often pulling late nights in Maria's cramped apartment, with papers, notebooks, and law books scattered across every available surface. For Alex, this wasn't just about helping his sister anymore. It was about sending a message to people like Mr. Gibson that discrimination, no matter how subtle, would not go unchecked. His commitment and drive inspired Maria, who took every chance she could to help him, eager to learn the ins and outs of the process and prove her own strength in the fight. One afternoon, Alex decided they needed more concrete evidence of Mr. Gibson's discriminatory practices. He contacted several tenants who had spoken to Maria and asked if they'd be willing to give formal statements or testify in court. Most were hesitant, fearful of retaliation, but a few brave souls agreed, encouraged by Maria's resolve. There was Mrs. Patel, the elderly woman who had lived in the building for 10 years, who shared stories of how Mr. Gibson had frequently threatened her with warnings over trivial matters, like keeping a small potted plant on her balcony or hosting family dinners that he claimed were disturbing the peace. Rachel and Thomas, the young couple living on the third floor, revealed how Mr. Gibson had served them a noise complaint every time they hosted a small gathering, even though other tenants who held louder parties were left alone. They admitted to feeling singled out, suspecting it was because they were the only mixed-race couple in the building. Alex spent hours recording these testimonies, asking detailed questions to uncover patterns and inconsistencies in Mr. Gibson's actions. The evidence began to paint a clear picture. Mr. Gibson's management style went beyond simple rule enforcement. It was an intentional, targeted campaign to make tenants from minority backgrounds feel uncomfortable, unwelcome, and ultimately pressured to leave. Alex compiled each testimony carefully, highlighting the parallels and creating a compelling narrative that showed Mr. Gibson's behavior was not only unethical, but illegal. The deeper they dug, the more troubling details they uncovered. Maria discovered through conversations with other tenants that Mr. Gibson had actually raised rent selectively, increasing rates disproportionately for newer tenants of color, while keeping rates stable for other residents. This revelation infuriated Alex, as it exposed Mr. Gibson's blatant disregard for fairness and equality. Alex added this information to their growing list of grievances, determined to prove that the landlord's actions weren't random, but methodically aimed at creating a hostile environment for specific tenants. Alongside witness testimonies, Alex gathered physical evidence to support their claims. He requested copies of Mr. Gibson's official letters to tenants, comparing language and tone across documents. He noticed that letters sent to Maria and others targeted for their backgrounds used harsher language and threatened legal action much faster than those sent to white tenants, who received more lenient wording and chances to correct their alleged infractions. Alex meticulously categorized these documents, each piece of paper adding weight to their case. The more involved Maria became in the process, the more her confidence grew. She started attending tenant rights workshops that Alex recommended, eager to educate herself on her rights and those of others in her building. At one meeting, she even spoke to a group about her experience, sharing her story as a way of inspiring others to stand up against unfair treatment. The attendees listened, moved by her courage, and several offered their own support, even suggesting they would reach out to Alex to discuss similar cases. Maria felt a sense of pride she hadn't experienced before, a growing awareness of her own strength. She wasn't just a passive participant in this fight anymore. She was a voice for others who had felt silenced. As the evidence piled up, Alex began drafting their case documents, shaping each argument with precision and purpose. He reviewed Maria's lease agreement in detail, analyzing clauses in fine print to ensure they covered every possible angle. He took particular interest in a vague clause about disturbances, which Mr. Gibson had repeatedly cited without clear examples. This clause, Alex believed, was designed to be weaponized selectively, giving Mr. Gibson a supposed legal basis for evicting tenants he simply didn't want. One evening, as they went over the case, Alex paused and looked at Maria thoughtfully. We have enough evidence to make a strong case, he said. But you should know that trials are tough. Mr. Gibson's lawyer will try to twist things. Make it seem like you're the one in the wrong. Maria met his gaze, her face steady. I know, Alex, but I'm ready. I'm not scared of him anymore. Alex smiled, a mixture of pride and admiration in his eyes. Good, because we're going to give him a fight he won't forget. With the trial date approaching, Alex prepared Maria for what to expect in the courtroom. He coached her on how to respond confidently, helping her practice delivering her statements with clarity and composure. They role-played potential scenarios, with Alex posing tough questions to help Maria stay calm under pressure. At first, the thought of facing Mr. Gibson and his lawyer intimidated her, but the more they rehearsed, the stronger she felt. She realized that this was no longer about her fear or her anger. It was about her right to live in peace and dignity, free from discrimination. On the eve of the trial, Maria found herself reflecting on everything she and Alex had accomplished together. They had not only built a strong case, but they had also repaired a relationship that had once felt beyond saving. She knew she could not have faced this battle alone and felt a profound gratitude for her brother's support and dedication. Alex had reignited a spark in her, a reminder of her own resilience and the importance of standing up for what was right. As they finished their final preparations, Maria looked at Alex with a newfound sense of solidarity. They were more than siblings now. They were partners in a shared mission. The fight against Mr. Gibson wasn't just about keeping her home. It was about justice for her, for Leo, and for all the tenants who had silently endured discrimination. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her purpose settling within her. Tomorrow, they would enter that courtroom, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. With everything finally in place, they sat in quiet reflection, both aware of the significance of what they were about to do. They had transformed her pain and fear into a cause, a fight for fairness and dignity. And no matter the outcome, Maria knew she had already won something priceless: her own voice. The courtroom was packed on the day of the trial, with a mix of curious onlookers, fellow tenants who had come to support Maria, and others who were there simply to witness the outcome of a case that was already making waves in the community. Maria sat beside Alex, her hands folded tightly in her lap, nerves buzzing under her skin. Alex, however, was the picture of calm, his face composed and focused as he shuffled through the neatly organized stack of documents he'd prepared. He leaned over to Maria, giving her a reassuring nod. "We've got this," he whispered, and she took a deep breath, steadying herself. As the proceedings began, Mr. Gibson entered the courtroom with his lawyer, an imposing man who seemed to exude confidence and disdain in equal measure. Gibson avoided looking in Maria's direction, his expression stoic and indifferent. But Maria felt her anger flare up, a reminder of why she was there, to expose the injustice she and others had suffered at his hands. The judge called the court to order, and Alex began by presenting an opening statement that was both compelling and heartfelt. He spoke not only as a lawyer, but as someone who had a personal connection to the case, detailing the struggles Maria had faced as a single mother, trying to provide a safe home for her son. He described how Mr. Gibson's eviction notice had come without warning, targeting Maria with vague accusations that seemed inconsistent and suspect. Then, Alex laid out the core of their case. Mr. Gibson had not only wrongfully targeted his sister, but had shown a clear pattern of discrimination against multiple tenants. "This is more than an eviction," Alex told the court, his voice strong and unwavering. "This is about the right to live without fear, to feel secure in one's own home. Mr. Gibson has abused his power, wielding it against tenants who he deems unworthy based on nothing more than their backgrounds. This isn't just unethical, it's unlawful." When it was Mr. Gibson's lawyer's turn to speak, he attempted to portray Maria as a difficult tenant, implying that her eviction was a necessary action to maintain the building's standards. He cited various complaints about noise and disturbances, claiming they were documented and valid. As the lawyer spoke, Maria felt a pang of anxiety, the familiar worry creeping back as she wondered if people might believe these baseless accusations. But one glance at Alex, who met her eyes with a calm, reassuring expression, helped her hold on to her resolve. The real test came when Alex began calling witnesses to the stand, starting with Mrs. Patel, the elderly tenant who had lived in the building for years. She was nervous, clutching her handbag tightly, but Alex guided her gently through her testimony, asking her to describe her experiences with Mr. Gibson's warnings and complaints about her harmless flower pots and family visits. Mrs. Patel's voice was soft but steady as she recounted how Mr. Gibson had often reprimanded her over trivial matters, making her feel unwelcome in her own home. She explained how he had issued formal warnings, implying that if she didn't comply, she could be forced to leave. "I was afraid to even have my grandchildren over," she admitted, glancing nervously at Mr. Gibson. "Because I knew he was watching." Alex used her testimony to demonstrate a pattern, showing that Mr. Gibson had a history of targeting specific tenants for inconsequential issues. Mrs. Patel's statements visibly unsettled Mr. Gibson, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze fixed on the table. Next, Alex called Rachel and Thomas, the young couple on the third floor. They testified about the noise complaints that Mr. Gibson had filed against them whenever they had friends over, even for small gatherings. Rachel explained how they felt singled out, especially since other tenants frequently held much louder parties without consequence. Alex's questions were precise, carefully piecing together the experiences of these tenants to reveal a systematic bias in Mr. Gibson's management. The judge listened intently, and Maria could see that he was beginning to connect the dots, his expression shifting as the story of discrimination unfolded. But the turning point came when Alex called Maria to the stand. She took a deep breath, standing up and walking to the witness chair, feeling the weight of all the eyes in the courtroom on her. Alex began by asking her to recount the day she received the eviction notice, prompting her to describe the shock and confusion she'd felt and how she'd initially tried to reason with Mr. Gibson. She spoke with a newfound clarity, her voice strong and steady as she recounted the moments that had driven her to take action. "I knew that I hadn't done anything wrong," she said firmly, glancing at Mr. Gibson, "but it didn't seem to matter. I could tell from the way he looked at me that he'd already made up his mind, and I felt like I didn't belong there, like my son and I were less important." The lawyer representing Mr. Gibson attempted to rattle Maria, questioning her about supposed noise complaints and trying to paint her as an irresponsible tenant. But Maria held her ground, countering every accusation calmly, often referring back to the clear record of her responsible conduct in the building. She described her daily routine, her efforts to maintain a quiet home environment, and her dedication to creating a stable life for Leo. At one point, Mr. Gibson's lawyer pushed harder, trying to provoke her by suggesting that perhaps her eviction had been justified. But Maria didn't flinch, simply saying, "I've always done my best to follow the rules. My only fault was in not standing up sooner." With each word she spoke, Maria felt her confidence grow, the support from Alex and the other tenants strengthening her resolve. When she finished her testimony, she caught Alex's approving nod. She knew she'd done everything she could to make her voice heard. Finally, it was Alex's turn to summarize the case. He addressed the court with a quiet intensity, laying out the evidence one last time and driving home the message that Mr. Gibson's actions went beyond personal grievances. "What we have here," he concluded, "is a case of calculated prejudice. This is a pattern of discrimination intended to create a hostile environment for tenants like my sister, who deserve the right to feel safe and respected in their own home." This case is not just about Maria Lopez. It's about standing against the misuse of power and the right for every individual to be treated with dignity. The judge took a moment to consider the evidence, the testimonies, and the arguments presented. The silence in the room was heavy as everyone waited. Then, in a clear and steady voice, the judge delivered his ruling. He found in favor of Maria, declaring that Mr. Gibson's actions constituted discrimination and ordering him to pay damages. The judge also mandated that Mr. Gibson implement policy changes to ensure fair treatment for all tenants going forward. A wave of relief washed over Maria, her chest filling with a lightness she hadn't felt in months. Alex reached over, giving her hand a squeeze, his face breaking into a rare smile. They'd done it. They had stood up to Mr. Gibson and won, not just for Maria, but for every tenant who had suffered under his rule. As they walked out of the courtroom, Maria felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not only for the outcome, but for Alex's unwavering support. She looked around at the faces of the tenants who had come to support her, each of them nodding, smiling, sharing in her victory. This was more than a personal win. It was a triumph for the entire community. In that moment, Maria realized that she had found something even more valuable than a place to live. She had found her voice, her courage, and a renewed sense of purpose. She had stood up against an injustice and won, setting an example for Leo and everyone around her that it was always worth fighting for what was right. And with Alex by her side, she knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she would never face them alone again. As Maria and Alex walked out of the courthouse, a group of tenants and supporters gathered around them, clapping and offering congratulations. Maria felt a profound sense of relief washing over her, like a weight had finally been lifted from her shoulders. She smiled, something she hadn't done freely in what felt like a long time, and the tension in her body began to dissolve. People she barely knew were shaking her hand, thanking her, and sharing their own small stories of injustice. She realized then that this victory was much bigger than her. It was a statement, a step forward for everyone who had suffered under Mr. Gibson's prejudice. As the crowd dispersed, Alex took her aside, his face beaming with pride. "You did it, Maria," he said, giving her a hug. "We did it." She hugged him back tightly, overwhelmed by gratitude and love for her brother. The battle had reconnected them, mending their fractured bond and reminding her of the strength that family could offer. She thought of all the years they had lost, the arguments and misunderstandings that had kept them apart, and felt a pang of regret. But in that moment, standing together after their shared victory, she knew that they had a fresh start, a new chance to be there for each other. Over the next few days, Maria noticed how her victory began to ripple through the community. Word spread quickly about the case, and more tenants came forward with stories of their own mistreatment. Inspired by Maria's courage, others who had been afraid to speak out began to organize. Maria attended a meeting where tenants discussed their shared experiences and began planning ways to ensure that no one else would go through what she had endured. They talked about forming a tenant association, something that could provide support and resources for people facing unfair treatment. Maria felt a swelling pride as she listened, knowing that her stand against Mr. Gibson had sparked something much larger than herself. For Maria, the changes in her own life were also deeply personal. She found herself more confident, carrying herself with a newfound strength. She wasn't just a quiet, hard-working single mother anymore. She was someone who had fought for her rights and won. Leo seemed to sense it too. He watched her with admiration, picking up on the lighter tone in her voice, the ease in her movements. One evening, as they sat together over dinner, he looked up at her with his big, curious eyes and asked, "Mom, are we safe now?" Maria felt a rush of emotion at his question, realizing how deeply the uncertainty and fear had affected him too. She reached across the table, taking his small hand in hers, and nodded. "Yes, Leo, we're safe, and no one is going to take that away from us again." In the days that followed, Maria began to think about what her next steps would be. She knew she couldn't let this victory be a one-time stand. She wanted to continue making a difference, not only for herself and Leo, but for others who needed support. She started volunteering with a local tenant advocacy group, sharing her story at community centers and neighborhood meetings. She found herself standing before rooms filled with people who were just as anxious and uncertain as she had been, encouraging them to know their rights, to stand up against unfair treatment, and to believe in their own strength. Through her involvement, Maria grew close to several other activists and advocates who had dedicated their lives to fighting injustice. They taught her the ins and outs of tenant rights, legal procedures, and community organizing. She soaked it all in, inspired by the resilience and courage of the people around her. Slowly, She became something of a leader in her community, a role she had never imagined for herself but now embraced wholeheartedly. One day, as she was organizing a tenant meeting, Alex surprised her by stopping by. He watched from the back of the room as she addressed the group, speaking with the poise and confidence of someone who had truly found her voice. After the meeting, he approached her with a proud smile. "I didn't know my little sister was such a powerhouse," he said, teasing but full of admiration. Maria laughed, feeling a warmth in her chest. "I didn't know either," she admitted, "but I think this is just a beginning." They sat down together over coffee, talking about everything that had happened and where they would go from here. Alex, who had been so focused on his legal career, admitted that Maria's case had reminded him of the reasons he had become a lawyer in the first place. "It's easy to get caught up in the routine, to forget why you started," he said thoughtfully. "But this helping you, fighting for what's right, it's reminded me of my purpose." Together, they began to discuss ways they could continue their work together, using Alex's legal expertise and Maria's firsthand experience to help others. They brainstormed ideas for community workshops on tenant rights, legal clinics, and other resources that could empower people facing difficult situations. The idea of working together, not just as siblings but as partners, filled them both with excitement and purpose. As the weeks passed, Maria felt a deep contentment settling into her life. She had her home, her son was happy, and her relationship with Alex had been restored. But more than that, she had found a calling, a purpose that gave her life new meaning. She and Alex began hosting regular workshops, and Maria became a regular speaker at events, sharing her journey and encouraging others to stand up for their rights. Her story became a symbol of resilience in the community, a reminder that even the most daunting battles could be won when you had the courage to stand up. One evening, as Maria and Leo settled down on their couch, she looked around their small but beloved apartment. The walls felt warmer, the space cozier, and she realized that it wasn't just a place. It was a home, one that they had fought to protect. She wrapped her arms around Leo, feeling a profound sense of peace. She had come so far from that fearful woman who had once sat on this very couch, wondering if she would have to leave it all behind. As she looked into Leo's eyes, she felt a surge of pride. She had shown him what it meant to be strong, to stand up for oneself, and to fight for what was right. And she knew, with every fiber of her being, that she had created a legacy for him, a legacy of resilience, courage, and unwavering hope. A few weeks after the trial, life settled into a new, peaceful rhythm for Maria and Leo. Their apartment, once a place of fear and uncertainty, now felt like a sanctuary, filled with the quiet pride of someone who had fought for it and won. Maria noticed subtle but powerful changes in how she carried herself, the way she moved around the space, each room a reminder of her victory and the strength she had discovered within herself. Her relationship with Alex also blossomed in unexpected ways. What had begun as a reconnection out of necessity transformed into a profound, enduring bond. Alex visited more frequently, and they began spending time together beyond planning legal strategies or advocacy work. They took Leo to the park, had Sunday dinners, and shared stories of their childhood, finding joy in memories they hadn't spoken of in years. In these moments, Maria realized just how much she had missed having family close by. One Sunday afternoon, after a meal filled with laughter and stories, Alex took her aside. "You know, I've been thinking about starting a pro bono project focused on housing rights. The work we did together reminded me of how much impact we can have." He paused, searching her eyes. "And I'd love it if you'd consider joining me, even part-time. You have a way of reaching people that well, it's special." Maria. The idea caught her off guard, but it also excited her. She felt a pull to continue the work they'd started, to turn her painful experience into a source of empowerment for others. And the idea of working alongside Alex, of using what she'd learned to help those still fighting their battles, felt right. "I'd love to," she said softly, and they shared a smile, a new partnership forming between them. As Maria began working with Alex on his housing rights project, She found herself embracing roles she'd never imagined for herself. She wasn't just sharing her story. She was helping design outreach programs, meeting with local officials to discuss tenant protections, and organizing community events that educated residents on their rights. People began to recognize her as a leader, someone who had not only experienced the struggle, but had triumphed over it. Her journey became a source of inspiration, and her name began to carry weight in the neighborhood. One evening, Maria spoke at a local event that Alex had helped organize, her first major public appearance since the trial. Standing before the crowd, she shared her story of fighting Mr. Gibson's eviction, of overcoming her own doubts and fears, and of discovering a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She spoke passionately about the importance of standing up for one's rights, about the power of community, and how everyone deserved to feel safe and respected in their homes. The crowd responded with cheers and applause, and afterward, people approached her to share their own stories, asking for advice and thanking her for her courage. A young woman with a small child, not much older than Leo, came up to her, eyes shining with tears. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "You've given me hope. I was afraid to speak up, but after hearing you, I feel like I can." Maria hugged her, feeling the weight of her impact, realizing that this was no longer just her story. It was a beacon for others, a reminder that no one had to face these struggles alone. In that moment, she felt more certain than ever that this was her calling. She had turned her pain into purpose, her fear into fuel, and it had brought her here, to a place of strength and solidarity. As Maria and Alex's project grew, they began working with other organizations, joining forces with established housing rights groups to push for policy changes that would protect tenants from discriminatory practices. Maria found herself meeting with city officials, learning about housing laws, and even speaking at city council meetings. She was no longer just a tenant who had fought back. She had become a respected voice in her community, an advocate who spoke on behalf of those who felt powerless. Through this work, Maria developed new friendships, connecting with people from all walks of life who shared her commitment to justice. She no longer felt alone in her mission. She was part of a network, a movement, and each day she became more knowledgeable, more capable, more certain in her ability to make a difference. She found herself dreaming bigger, imagining a world where everyone, no matter their background, could feel safe and valued in their homes. At home, Leo thrived, taking pride in his mother's work. He often asked about her projects, and Maria would tell him about the meetings she'd had or the people she'd helped. She saw in him a budding curiosity, a desire to understand the world, and she encouraged it, knowing that the legacy she was building was as much for him as it was for herself. One night, as they sat together reading before bedtime, Leo looked up at her and asked, "Mom, does this mean we'll always be safe now?" Maria hugged him close, feeling the enormity of his question. "Yes, Leo," she whispered. "I'll always make sure of that." She knew that her work was far from over, but she was filled with a sense of purpose and peace, knowing that she was doing everything she could to create a world where he, and others like him, would never have to face the struggles she had endured. In the months that followed, Maria and Alex's project gained traction. They succeeded in advocating for new tenant protections, policies that would hold landlords accountable for discriminatory practices and ensure fair treatment for all residents. Their work inspired other neighborhoods to start similar initiatives, creating a ripple effect that extended far beyond their original case. And through it all, Maria continued to grow, evolving from a mother fighting to protect her home into a leader who was making a difference for countless families. As she looked back on her journey, from the moment she received that eviction notice to the triumph in the courtroom, Maria felt a deep gratitude for everything she had endured. The hardships, the fear, even the pain of confronting her past with Alex, it had all brought her to this point. She had not only found her voice, but had given it purpose, transforming her personal struggle into a movement of hope and resilience for others. One evening, as she stood on her balcony, looking out over the city lights, Maria felt a quiet peace settle within her. She had built a future for herself and Leo that was rooted in courage, dignity, and the unbreakable belief in justice. And though the path had been difficult, she knew it had been worth every step. She had found herself, her strength, and her purpose. And that was a victory she would carry with her always.